It was supposed to be just another uneventful Friday. The last period before spring break. Everyone's favorite time of the year. The school day was winding down, and the mood was light. The air was thick with anticipation, as the hours until the end of the day slipped away like sand through an hourglass. We were all getting restless, the thought of the break ahead of us making it harder and harder to concentrate. The entire week had felt like a marathon, and the finish line was finally in sight. But in calculus class, as usual, we were stuck in the grind of equations and theories. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder with each passing minute. Most of us were trying to stay awake, half listening to our teacher drone on, but it was clear that the energy in the room had shifted. People were distracted, some doodling in notebooks, others whispering about their weekend plans. The thought of free time on the horizon made the hours in the classroom drag even more. Everyone was eagerly waiting for the bell to ring, signaling freedom, even if that freedom was just for a few short days. We didn't have a test that day, thankfully. Some of my friends had been dreading the exams that had been scheduled with their other teachers, but here in calculus, we were just coasting through the final period. Our laid-back teacher, seeing the restlessness in the room, decided to change things up a bit. He rolled his chair over to the front of the classroom, his usual easygoing smile plastered on his face as he turned on his computer. "All right, class, let's play a quick brand logo quiz. Let's see who knows their stuff." It was one of those mindless games, sparkle calm, something that didn't require any real thought. But it was fun. We laughed as we tried to guess brands from their logo silhouettes, Nike, Adidas, Apple, and a dozen others. The classroom, for the first time that day, felt lighthearted. Everyone was playing along, shouting out answers and joking around. It was a temporary escape from the monotony of school, and for a brief moment, it felt like just another day. One of those days where you could let your guard down and get lost in the simplicity of a quiz. But then, the moment we all unknowingly feared arrived. The sudden crackle of the loudspeaker shattered the calm atmosphere like a glass breaking on the floor. It was the dean's voice, but it wasn't the usual monotone voice we'd grown used to over the years. No, this time it was different. There was a frantic edge to it, something we'd never heard before. My heart instantly started pounding in my chest. This is not a drill. Lockdown. Now! A cold chill ran through my veins as the words echoed through the classroom. Everything stopped. Time itself seemed to freeze. I looked around the room. My friends, the students, the teacher. Everyone was still wide-eyed, unsure of what had just happened. The usual hum of the school seemed to vanish, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. The teacher, usually laid back and calm, stood frozen for a split second, processing the command. His face changed from one of confusion to something closer to panic. Without a word, he turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of the door clicking shut was deafening. He motioned for us to gather in the back corner of the classroom, away from the windows. We didn't question it. There was no time to ask why or what was happening. We just did as we were told. The cold, sterile room seemed even colder now, the air heavy with fear. The faint buzz of an electrical panel in the back of the room hummed in the silence. The minutes dragged on. 2 minutes, maybe 3, but it felt like an eternity. I could hear the rapid breathing of some of my classmates, their nervous shuffling adding to the growing tension. Every time someone moved, I could feel my pulse quicken. The sound of footsteps from the hallway outside sent shivers down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the fear or the cold that made me shake, but either way, the air was thick with dread. We all knew something was wrong. Something big was happening, but we had no idea what. And then the buzzing stopped. It wasn't a sudden or sharp silence. It was the kind of quiet that made everything feel eerie. The power had been cut. In that instant, I realized how vulnerable we were. No lights, no phone service, no communication with anyone outside. Just us, alone, trapped in this dark, quiet room with no idea what was going on. It was strange. The power had gone out, And yet the school hadn't come to a complete halt. There were still distant noises, faint footsteps, voices echoing through the halls, the rustle of doors opening and closing. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds, but it was impossible. We were cut off. I glanced over at my classmates, some of them visibly trembling, others sitting perfectly still, eyes wide with fear. No one dared speak. Minutes passed, but it felt like an hour. I kept looking at the door, waiting for someone to come in, to tell us it was all just a mistake, that we could go back to class, finish our quiz, and wait for the bell to ring. But that wasn't going to happen. The quiet buzzing sound had been replaced by something far worse, the unmistakable sound of a man's voice. It started low, almost like a growl, then built to a fevered scream. I could feel my chest tighten as the man's voice echoed down the hallway outside. He was shouting something unintelligible, but the tone of his voice made it clear that he wasn't in control of his actions. His words became clearer, and with them, a sense of dread. "I'll kill all of you," he screamed. The words rang through the hallway, reverberating in the silence like the sound of a gunshot. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone in my fear. 2 girls in the class began to cry, their sobs breaking the silence like cracks in glass. I could see their bodies shaking, eyes wide with terror. The man's voice grew louder, more frantic, and with each scream, I could feel the fear spread through the room like wildfire. We were no longer just students sitting in a classroom. We were prisoners in a nightmare. The sound of metal slamming against the lockers echoed from the hallway, louder now, as if the man was right outside. Banging, banging, banging. His rage was palpable, and I could feel the pulse in my throat. There was no hiding from this. It was real. This wasn't just a drill or some prank. This was something much, much worse. I looked at the teacher. His face was pale now, his hands shaking as he motioned for us to stay quiet, to keep still. We didn't need a reminder. Every one of us was frozen in place, holding our breath, listening intently for the next sound. Each bang on the door, each scream that rattled the walls, felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. The man's voice disappeared down the hallway. The banging ceased. Silence returned, but it was a silence that felt unnatural, unsettling. We sat in that silence, unsure of what to do next. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the dean's voice crackled over the loudspeaker once more. He explained the situation, though his voice still held an edge of panic. An unstable man had entered the school and attacked the woman at the front desk. She had fled the building, screaming, and no one was sure if the man was armed. The power had been cut. The hallways were now empty, and the school was in chaos. It was just the beginning, and we were trapped in our classrooms with no idea what would happen next. The lockdown had begun, and none of us knew how long it would last. The moment those words hit, everything changed. Lockdown. Now, they echoed in my head, replaying over and over. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. Our teacher, usually the epitome of calm, suddenly seemed rattled, his face draining of color. The world outside our classroom seemed to vanish, as if we were cut off from everything we knew. The routine we had been following just moments before, laughing at a brand quiz, exchanging jokes, faded into a backdrop of tension and fear. Without a moment's hesitation, our teacher rushed to turn off the lights. The classroom, which had once been a place of boredom and routine, now felt like a dark, suffocating cage. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of light and sound sharpening every little noise. My classmates and I moved swiftly, without speaking, each of us aware of the gravity of the situation. We gathered in the back corner of the room, huddled together as though somehow the closeness of our bodies would shield us from the unknown terror outside. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights above ceased abruptly, followed by an unnatural stillness that was almost suffocating. I didn't need to see the hallway to know what had just happened. The school's power had been cut, leaving us in a strange, unnerving darkness. Every footstep, every small noise in the hallway, now echoed in the silence, amplifying our growing sense of dread. We sat there in that cold, inky darkness, unable to do anything but wait and wonder what was going on. My mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. What could have caused this? It was supposed to be a normal day, wasn't it? There was nothing to suggest that something this terrifying could happen. But the chilling uncertainty hung in the air like a storm cloud. We exchanged nervous glances, our eyes wide with confusion and fear. A few minutes passed, each one dragging by like an eternity. We stayed there, frozen, listening to the silence as our thoughts ran wild. That's when it happened. A sound broke through the stillness, a low scream, distant at first, but growing louder by the second. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Panic crept up my spine, and I realized that whatever was happening outside, it wasn't something normal. Something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just a drill or some minor disruption. This was real, and the weight of that realization pressed down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. As the scream continued, I could hear two girls in the class start crying, their sobs sharp and panicked. Their distress only added to the growing tension in the room. We all knew that something was happening, but none of us dared to ask questions. We were too afraid to voice what we were all thinking. What if it wasn't just a lockdown? What if it was something worse? What if we weren't safe? And then, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal rang out through the hallway, sharp and violent. Someone was slamming into the lockers outside, making the entire building shake with each blow. The sound echoed in the stillness of the classroom, sending waves of fear through all of us. Then came the voice, the one that would haunt me for years to come. "I'll kill all of you." It wasn't loud at first, but it was enough. Enough to send a shockwave through the class. My stomach lurched, and my breath caught in my throat. The man's voice, frantic, deranged, bounced off the walls, and the terror in it was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the threat, no confusion about his intentions. He wasn't playing games. He wasn't here for any kind of protest or a simple act of violence. He was here for something far worse. The air in the classroom thickened. The fear was palpable, crawling up my skin and making my heart race even faster. I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead as my eyes flicked around the room, desperately searching for any kind of answer, any kind of explanation. But no one had one. No one knew what to do. We were trapped in that dark corner, just waiting for the man to come closer, for the threat to turn real. Another slam, louder this time. The lockers shuddered, and then a scream. A girl's voice pierced the tension, high-pitched and filled with panic. It was the sound of someone who truly feared for their life. One of the girls in our class couldn't take it anymore and screamed out in terror, her voice cracking in fear. In that moment, I thought I might die. I thought that the sound of that man's voice would be the last thing I ever heard. We all huddled closer, holding our breath, every one of us waiting for the next step. What if the man broke in? What if he was already inside the school? I could hear him now, his voice growing closer, echoing down the hallway. It was as if he was coming for us. Every thud of his footsteps made the walls feel smaller, the space more confined. The panic was suffocating. The banging moved from the lockers to our door. With each strike, my heart seemed to stop. The sound was so violent, so relentless, that it felt like the door itself might break at any moment. The man's angry voice was close now. I couldn't understand his words anymore, but the rage, the hatred in his voice was enough to freeze us all in place. The fear was contagious. It spread through the room like wildfire, each of us more terrified than the last. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the door shook under the force of another bang. "Open up," he shouted. His voice was feral, crazed. The pounding on the door continued, each blow making the classroom feel smaller, the walls closer. My breath hitched as the realization hit me. This wasn't a drill. It wasn't some prank. This was real. And we were sitting ducks, waiting to be next. In the chaos of the moment, another scream rang out, this time from one of the girls in the class. It was a raw, guttural sound that sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the room at my classmates. Some were crying, others were wide-eyed with terror, frozen in place. We were all victims of the unknown. We were trapped in that classroom, helpless. As the sounds outside grew louder, more desperate, we had no idea what was coming next. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The pounding on the door continued, each strike getting louder, more desperate. It seemed like time had stopped entirely. All we could do was wait, sit in that cold darkness, and pray that we would make it out alive. The terror was real now. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. We weren't just students anymore. We were prisoners, caught in a nightmare that no one had seen coming. The classroom, which had once been a place for idle chatter and half-hearted attempts at learning, had turned into a dark, suffocating space where fear gripped us all. Our teacher, who usually exuded a calm and composed demeanor, now stood frozen, wide-eyed and anxious. He shushed us, his voice trembling with an unspoken fear. But his words didn't have the calming effect he'd intended. The panic that had already set in could not be silenced by a simple shoo. We were all too aware of the threat just outside the door, too aware of how vulnerable we were. The noise from the hallway grew louder, more chaotic. The banging against the lockers became more violent, as if the man was pounding on them with all his rage, each strike a reminder of the danger that was so close. Every loud thud made me flinch. Every sound seemed to increase the pressure in my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. Then, just when I thought I might suffocate from the fear, the sound shifted. It moved toward our classroom door. I could feel my throat tighten. We were trapped. There was no escape, no way to protect ourselves. I wasn't sure if it was the fact that we were in the dark or the knowledge that we were mere feet away from the man, but a primal fear coursed through me. It wasn't just the noise. It was the sense that something terrible was about to happen, that it was inevitable. Then came a scream, sharp, raw, and full of terror. One of the girls in the class couldn't hold it in any longer, her fear spilling out as she shrieked. The sound of her voice only amplified the chaos in the room. As if in response to the scream, the man outside began shouting. His voice muffled but unmistakable. "Open up!" His voice was like a knife, cutting through the silence. The pounding against the door, now a menacing rhythm, felt like time itself had slowed down. Each knock against the door seemed to stretch for hours, each second dragging on with the weight of a lifetime. My mind raced, imagining what might happen if the door gave way, if he somehow got inside. What would he do to us? Could we even fight back? The tension in the room was unbearable. More girls were crying now, their sobs echoing around the cold, dark classroom. We huddled together in the corner, instinctively seeking comfort in each other's presence. But there was no comfort to be found. The fear was all-encompassing. No one knew what was going to happen next. Then, just when I thought my heart would explode from the sheer intensity of it all, the banging stopped. It was as though the world had gone silent again, and for a split second, we all held our breath, hoping against hope that the nightmare was over. But it wasn't. The man's screams slowly faded into the distance as he moved away from our classroom, his voice growing quieter until it was no longer audible. The tension in the room was palpable, but we couldn't let ourselves relax yet. It wasn't over. Not yet. It felt like an eternity had passed in those few minutes, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one who struggled to make sense of what had just happened. My mind couldn't quite process it all. We sat there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, that would tell us we were safe. It was then that the voice of the dean crackled through the loudspeaker, the sound a strange mix of reassurance and fear. The lockdown was initiated because an unstable individual has entered the building, he said, his voice sounding strained. He has assaulted the woman at the front desk and forced her to flee the building, screaming. My blood ran cold at the news. An unstable person? Assaulting a woman at the front desk? And then there was the terrifying uncertainty. Was the man armed? What were his intentions? We didn't know, and the uncertainty was more terrifying than anything else. We could only guess what kind of madness had driven him to this point, but one thing was clear. We weren't safe. We sat in stunned silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. There was no safety, no guarantee that we wouldn't be the next target. The lockdown wasn't just a precaution, it was a necessity. And as we continued to wait in that dark, cold classroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse, something that was still out there. The threat was real, and for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it felt like to be trapped, helpless, vulnerable, and at the mercy of someone who seemed completely unpredictable. But as the minutes ticked by, the fear didn't go away. It only grew stronger because now we knew the threat was not over. It was still out there, lurking in the hallways, and there was nothing we could do but wait and pray that we would make it out alive. Every creak of the building, every distant footstep, sent my heart into overdrive. We were left in that uneasy silence, the only sound being the occasional sob of a classmate and the faint hum of the air conditioning, which seemed out of place against the overwhelming tension. It felt like hours had passed, and yet the minutes continued to crawl. Time had slowed down, just as my fear had amplified. We had no idea what was happening outside the room, but we knew the worst was yet to come.